Street musician shivered in the freezing cold. What John did next stunned the crowd. New York City, December 1973. A city of 10 million stories, each one pressing against the next with the relentless force of urban ambition. But on a frozen corner in Greenwich Village, on a night when the temperature had plunged to single digits and the wind off the Hudson cut like a blade, one story was unfolding in near total invisibility. A teenage girl with a violin, a nearly empty case, and fingers so cold she could barely feel the strings. What if John Lennon walked around that corner? And what he did next stunned an entire city block into absolute, breathless silence. The year is 1973. New York City in December was a particular kind of beautiful and a particular kind of brutal. The shop windows of Fifth Avenue blazed with Christmas light, their decorations a manufactured warmth that existed in deliberate contrast to the cold pressing against the glass outside. The streets of Midtown moved with their usual furious commerce, taxis cutting through intersections, pedestrians hunched against the wind, the great machinery of the city grinding on regardless of temperature, regardless of season, regardless of the individual human stories being lived within its gears. But in Greenwich Village, the city breathed differently. The village had always occupied a particular space in New York's geography, not just physical, but spiritual. It was the neighborhood that had given America its folk revival, its beat poets, its radical theater, its tradition of art made not for commerce, but for the pure, desperate necessity of expression. Bob Dylan had played its coffeehouses. Jimi Hendrix had walked its streets. And now, in the winter of 1973, it was home to John Lennon, who had chosen it precisely because it was the one neighborhood in the city where a man in round glasses and a worn coat could walk without becoming an event. He walked often, in the evenings especially, when the creative pressure of the day had built to a point where movement was the only release, when the apartment felt too small for the size of what was happening inside his head. He walked without destination, without agenda, his hands in his pockets and his collar turned up against the cold, absorbing the city in the particular, focused way of a man who understood that everything he observed was eventually raw material for something. The December cold that year was exceptional even by New York standards. A front had moved in from the north and settled over the city with the grim permanence of an unwelcome guest, pushing temperatures down into territory that made the city's usual indifference to individual suffering feel especially cruel. The homeless clustered in doorways. The street vendors packed up early. The usual population of sidewalk performers, guitarists, and saxophonists who animated the village's corners and subway entrances had largely retreated indoors or simply stayed home. Largely, but not entirely, because on the corner of Bleecker and Thompson, in the full force of that December wind, a girl was playing the violin, and John Lennon, turning that corner with his hands deep in his coat pockets and his mind somewhere else entirely, was about to find her. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon. In December of 1973, he was a man in a complicated season of his own. The lost weekend, that turbulent, restless period of separation from Yoko, had begun, and with it a particular quality of solitude that was different from the chosen isolation of creative retreat. This was the solitude of a man unmoored, navigating his days with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who understands that the ground beneath them is less stable than it appears. He was 33 years old. He had been famous for a decade. He had written songs that had become the soundtrack of a generation's most profound moments. Its grief, its hope, its rage, its tenderness. He had stood on stages before hundreds of thousands of people and felt the overwhelming, almost terrifying force of collective human emotion directed at him like a beam of concentrated light. And yet, on these December evenings in the village, walking alone through the frozen streets, he felt most clearly what he had always known but rarely admitted. that fame was the world's most elaborate form of loneliness. He moved through the village with the slightly distracted air of a man whose mind was never entirely where his body was. His round glasses caught the light of the street lamps and the shop windows, reflecting back a world that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. A man walking. Nothing more. The streets of the village at that hour were largely empty, the cold having driven most people inside. The usual warmth of the neighborhood, its cafes spilling conversation onto the pavements, its bars glowing amber through frosted windows, its peculiar, democratic mix of artists and students and longtime residents moving through their evenings, was contracted, compressed, driven inward by the temperature. The streets themselves felt abandoned, their usual energy replaced by something quieter and less forgiving. He heard the violin before he turned the corner. A thread of music in the cold air, fragile but insistent, cutting through the wind with the particular, penetrating quality that the violin possesses above all other instruments, the quality of sounding, even from a distance, like a human voice. He slowed without quite deciding to slow, turned the corner without quite deciding to turn it, and found her. Her name was Rosa Carvalho. She was 16 years old, the daughter of Brazilian immigrants who had come to New York 7 years earlier with the particular combination of courage and naivety that propels people across oceans in pursuit of better lives. Her father worked double shifts at a restaurant in Midtown. Her mother cleaned office buildings in the early mornings before the city woke up. They lived in a small apartment in the village, 4 of them in 3 rooms, and they had given Rosa everything they could, which included a considerable sacrifice for years of violin lessons with an elderly Hungarian teacher named Mr. Sabo who lived 2 blocks away and charged less than he should have because he recognized, in Rosa, something that made the reduced rate feel not like charity but like investment. Rosa was gifted, not in the vague, encouraging way that music teachers use the word with students whose parents are paying them. Gifted in the specific, undeniable, slightly frightening way that occasionally appears in young musicians. A natural relationship with the instrument that transcends technique, an ability to make sound that carries emotional information in ways that cannot be entirely explained by training or practice. She had been playing on this corner for 2 hours. The violin case lay open at her feet, lined with the worn velvet of its interior, containing $3 bills and some coins. The accumulation of 2 hours of playing in weather that had driven every other person off the streets. Her fingers, though she was wearing thin gloves with the fingertips cut away to allow contact with the strings, had passed through cold and into a deep, aching numbness that was beginning to affect her playing. Her breath came in small, visible clouds. Her shoulders were hunched against the wind, her body's instinctive attempt to make itself smaller, to reduce the surface area exposed to the cold. She was playing Vivaldi, the Winter Concerto from the Four Seasons, a choice that might have seemed ironic given the circumstances, but which was not ironic at all. It was simply the piece she knew best, the one that Mr. Sabo had spent the most time on, the one whose technical demands were precisely calibrated to the level she had reached after 4 years of practice. She played it because it was what she had, and what she had was extraordinary, even here, even now, even with numb fingers on a frozen corner where no one was listening. Except that someone had just turned the corner and stopped, and was listening, and was very, very still. John Lennon stood perhaps 10 feet from Rosa Carvalho and did not move. He had stopped with the abruptness of a man who has walked into something unexpected, not a physical obstacle, but something more disorienting. The music reached him in the cold air and did to him what the best music always does. It bypassed every layer of thought and defense and landed directly in the place where things are simply felt, without mediation, without translation. He watched her play. He watched her cold, stiffened fingers move across the strings with a precision that should not have been possible given the temperature. He watched her face, which was focused inward in the particular way of musicians who are playing from memory rather than reading notation, turned slightly away from the world, present in the music rather than the street. He watched the small clouds of her breath dispersing in the wind. He watched the nearly empty violin case at her feet. He stood there for the entirety of the Vivaldi movement. He did not reach into his pocket. He did not make a sound. He simply listened, with the full, undivided attention that he gave to very few things in the world, until the last note faded into the December air. Rosa lowered her bow and looked up, and found herself looking at John Lennon. The recognition took a moment, the way it always did, the slight delay between seeing a famous face in an unexpected context and the mind's ability to process the information correctly. Rosa blinked, looked again. Her cold, reddened face underwent a series of rapid, visible transitions. Confusion, then dawning recognition, then the specific, overwhelmed expression of someone who has just understood that the situation they are in is not the situation they thought they were in. John, watching her face go through these transitions, felt the familiar, complicated mixture of feelings that recognition always produced in him. The slight contraction of privacy, the awareness of the distance it created, and the genuine, human warmth that he felt toward people who reacted with honest bewilderment rather than performance. "You're very good," John said. His voice was quiet, slightly hoarse from the cold, stripped of any of the rock star apparatus that usually attended his public communications. Just a man on a corner, telling a girl she played well. Rosa stared at him. "You're John Lennon," she said. The statement came out not as an exclamation but as a careful, disbelieving confirmation, as if she were testing the words against reality to see if they held. "I am," John agreed. "And you're very good. How long have you been out here?" 2 hours, Rosa said. She looked down at her violin case, then back up at him. "It's been slow." John looked at the $3 bills in the case, then at her hands, the cut-off fingertip gloves, the visible redness of her skin despite the thin fabric. Then at her face, which was carrying the specific, controlled expression of someone who is cold and tired and unwilling to show how cold and tired they are. Something in his jaw tightened. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more corrosive. He looked up and down the empty street, then back at Rosa. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rosa. Rosa Carvalho." "Rosa," John said. "Why are you out here in this? It's freezing." Rosa looked at him with the direct, slightly defiant gaze of a teenager who has been asked a question whose answer she considers obvious. "Because this is where people walk," she said. "This is where they can hear me." "There's nobody walking," John said. "There wasn't," Rosa said. "And then there was." John looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face. A slow, quiet transformation that those who knew him well would have recognized as the precursor to a decision being made. He looked down the street again, then back at Rosa. "Play something else," he said. "Not the Vivaldi. Play me something you wrote yourself." Rosa blinked. "How do you know I write my own music?" "Because the way you play that concerto isn't the way someone plays a piece they only learned," John said. "It's the way someone plays who also makes their own. There's a difference." Rosa stared at him for another moment. Then, slowly, she raised her bow. And she played. What Rosa Carvalho played on that frozen corner of Bleecker and Thompson was not Vivaldi. It was not anything with a name or a catalog number or a formal structure that could be transcribed and handed to another musician. It was something she had been building in the private space of her practice sessions for 2 years, a piece that had no title because she had never considered it finished enough to deserve one, a melody that began in a place of quiet longing and moved, through a series of increasingly complex variations, into something that could only be described as the musical equivalent of a city scene from above at night. Vast, intricate, simultaneously lonely and luminous. She played it in the December cold with her numb fingers and her cut-off gloves, her breath making small clouds in the air around her, the wind carrying the sound down the empty street in both directions. And as she played, something began to happen. People came, not in large numbers, not immediately, but the music, that particular, penetrating quality of the violin in cold air, carrying further than it should, reaching into the warmth of the cafes and bars on the surrounding streets, pulled people outside with the irresistible, slightly baffled compulsion that live music sometimes produces in those who encounter it unexpectedly. A couple emerged from a cafe doorway, their coats half-buttoned, drawn by the sound. A man walking his dog slowed to a stop. A taxi driver pulled his cab to the curb, lowered his window, and sat listening. A woman who had been about to hail another cab simply stopped hailing and stood. And then there was John Lennon, who had not moved from the spot where he had stopped 10 minutes ago, standing in the December cold with his hands in his pockets and his collar turned up, listening with his eyes closed and his head very slightly bowed. in the posture of a man in the presence of something that requires his full attention. The crowd that gathered was small by any conventional measure, perhaps 20, 25 people, arranged in a rough semicircle around Rosa's corner, some of them recognizing John and choosing, with the particular village instinct for respecting privacy, not to make that recognition into an event. They simply listened. Together, on a frozen corner, in the brutal December cold, they stood and listened to a 16-year-old girl play music that she had made herself, for no audience, in no formal setting, with no commercial intention whatsoever. When Rosa finished, the silence that followed had the quality of something held, the collective breath of people who have been transported somewhere and are in the process of returning. Then the applause began, small and genuine, and utterly different from the applause of concert halls and arenas, which is always partly performance. This was the applause of people who had not planned to applaud, who were applauding because the alternative, silence, felt inadequate. John opened his eyes. He looked at Rosa, who was standing with her bow at her side and her eyes slightly wide, clearly overwhelmed by the presence of the small crowd that had materialized around her during the playing. Then he did something that nobody on that corner had anticipated. He reached into his coat. Not for money. Not yet. Not primarily. He reached in and withdrew the small, worn notebook that he always carried, the one whose pages were covered in his cramped handwriting, the one that held the incomplete ideas and half-formed lyrics that were the raw material of everything he made. He tore out a page, borrowed a pen from the man standing beside him, a stranger, who handed it over with the slightly stunned compliance of someone operating on instinct, and wrote something. Quickly, with the focused economy of a man who is accustomed to capturing things before they disappear. He folded the page and walked the 3 steps to Rosa's violin case. He placed the folded paper inside it, on top of the $3 bills. Then he reached into his other pocket and produced his wallet. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Rosa. Then he placed the entire wallet, not a bill extracted from it, not a deliberate selection of an appropriate amount, but the entire wallet, in the violin case. The crowd watched in complete silence. That music, John said to Rosa, his voice quiet and entirely steady, does not belong on this corner in the cold. It belongs somewhere it can be heard properly. The number on that paper, he nodded toward the folded note, is a producer I know. A good one. One who still remembers what music is actually for. He paused. Tell him I sent you. Tell him what you just played. Don't let him change it. Rosa looked at the wallet in her violin case. Then at John. I can't take your wallet, she said. You're not taking it, John said. I'm giving it. There's a difference. He looked at the small crowd that had gathered, the couple from the cafe, the dog walker, the taxi driver still parked at the curb with his window down, the woman who had stopped hailing her cab, and something moved across his face. Something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. She's been out here for 2 hours, John said to the crowd, not loudly, not theatrically, simply as a statement of fact directed at people who he had decided deserved to know it. In this cold, playing music she wrote herself. And she's better than most of what you'd pay $50 to hear indoors. He looked back at Rosa. You shouldn't have to stand in the freezing cold to be heard. Nobody should. The taxi driver got out of his cab. He walked to the violin case and added a $20 bill. The dog walker added a 10. The couple from the cafe, the woman who had stopped hailing her cab, the others, one by one, quietly, without announcement, they contributed what they had. No one performed the gesture. No one looked around to see if they were being observed being generous. They simply did it, in the particular, unrepeatable way that people do things when they have just been shown, by example, what the situation requires. The violin case, which had held $3 and some coins when John Lennon turned the corner, held something considerably different when the last person stepped back. Rosa Carvalho stood in the December cold and looked at it. Then she looked up at John, who was already preparing to continue his walk, his collar turned back up, his hands returning to his pockets. Why? Rosa said. The question was simple and direct and contained everything. John stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, with the full, focused attention that he had given her music. Because I was 16 once, he said quietly, and there was no one on the corner. He turned and walked away into the December dark, leaving behind him a frozen corner transformed, a small crowd of strangers who had become, briefly and indelibly, a community, and a 16-year-old girl standing with her violin in the cold, holding a folded piece of paper that contained a phone number and, beneath it, in John Lennon's cramped handwriting, for words, "Don't let them change you." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, the way people leave a space where something true has just occurred and the ordinary world feels, by comparison, slightly diminished. The taxi driver returned to his cab and sat for a moment before starting the engine, his hands on the wheel, staring at the corner where Rosa still stood. The couple from the cafe went back inside, but through the window, they could be seen talking with an animation that their evening had not possessed before the music. Rosa Carvalho stood on the corner for another 20 minutes after John Lennon disappeared around the corner and out of sight. She did not play again. She simply stood, her violin held loosely in one hand, her bow in the other, looking at the violin case and at the folded piece of paper resting inside it. The cold had not changed. The wind had not changed. The brutal December indifference of the city had not changed. But something in how she stood within it had shifted, had found a new angle, a new relationship to the weight of the night. She called the number 3 days later. She had waited that long partly because she needed time to believe the experience had been real, and partly because she was 16 years old and had no framework for the situation she found herself in, and the waiting was the only way she knew how to approach it carefully. The producer, a man named David Horowitz who operated a small but respected independent label out of a building on West 23rd Street, answered on the second ring. When Rosa said that John Lennon had given her the number, there was a pause on the line. Then David Horowitz said, "Tell me what you played." She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her to come in the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock and bring the piece she had described. The meeting lasted 4 hours. David Horowitz, who had been in the music business for 15 years and had developed the particular, protective skepticism of a man who has genuine talent destroyed by bad timing and bad decisions, listened to Rosa play with the focused, unblinking attention of someone encountering something that is making him revise his assumptions in real time. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "John was right. Don't let us change it." Rosa Carvalho recorded her first album at the age of 17, on a modest budget, in a small studio on the west side of Manhattan. It was released on David Horowitz's independent label in the spring of 1975, without commercial fanfare, without a publicity campaign, without any of the machinery that the major labels would have deployed. It sold modestly at first, the way honest, uncompromising music always sells at first, and then, gradually, found its audience. The audience that always finds the real thing, eventually, if the real thing is patient enough to wait for it. John Lennon never spoke publicly about the encounter. He did not call the label to check on Rosa's progress. He did not attend the recording sessions or insert himself into the process. He had done what he had done on that frozen corner and then walked away, which was, for those who understood how he operated, the most characteristic thing about the entire episode. The gesture complete, the wallet given, the number provided, the 4 words written, and then the December dark, and the next corner, and the next. John himself was changed in the quieter, more internal way that such encounters change people who are already constituted for reflection. In the weeks that followed, those close to him noted a shift in his creative output, a new attentiveness to the acoustic, to the stripped, the unadorned. Songs began to take shape that had at their center a quality of Winter Street music, of sound made not for applause, but for the necessity of its own existence. Whether Rosa's violin on that frozen corner was responsible, or whether it was simply coincident with a creative turn that would have occurred regardless, no one could say with certainty. But the turn was real, and the corner was real, and the girl in the cut-off gloves was real, her breath making small clouds in the December air, her fingers numb on the strings, playing music that deserved to be heard. Rosa Carvalho released 4 albums between 1975 and 1984. None of them were commercial phenomena in the conventional sense. All of them were the kind of work that endures, that finds, in each decade, a new generation of listeners who encounter it, as if for the first time, and feel the particular, disorienting recognition of hearing something that sounds like it was made specifically for them. The piece she had played on the frozen corner of Bleecker and Thompson, the piece without a title, the one she had been building for 2 years in the private space of her practice sessions, became the centerpiece of her first album. She called it simply, in the end, December Corner. She taught violin for 30 years at a community music school in the Bronx, working primarily with the children of immigrants. Children whose parents had come from other countries carrying the same combination of courage and naivety that had propelled her own parents across the Atlantic. She told the story of that December evening to her students occasionally, not as a legend, not as a tale designed to inspire, but as a simple account of what had happened. The cold, the empty case, the figure turning the corner, the folded piece of paper, the 4 words. Don't let them change you. She told it because she believed the most important part of the story was not John Lennon's wallet or John Lennon's phone number, or even John Lennon's presence on that corner. The most important part was the playing. The 2 hours of playing in the December cold for no audience, with numb fingers and nearly empty case, before any of the rest of it happened. The willingness to play when no one was listening. The discipline of the gift practiced not for reward, but for its own necessity. That's what he recognized, she told her students. Not that I was cold. Not that the case was empty. He recognized that I was playing anyway. And that was the only reason any of the rest of it was possible. John Lennon was shot and killed on December 8, 1980, on the pavement outside his home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He was 40 years old. The city that had received him, that had given him its streets to walk and its corners to turn and its December cold to move through with his hands in his pockets, received the news of his death with a silence that settled over its usual noise like snow. In Central Park, across the street from the Dakota where he had lived, people gathered in their thousands and stood together in the cold, holding candles, listening to his music played through speakers that someone had brought, letting the sound move through them the way the sound of Rosa's violin had moved through the small crowd on Bleecker Street 7 years before. Rosa Carvalho was among them. She carried her violin. She did not play it in the park that night. It did not feel like a night for playing. It felt like a night for listening. But she carried it, the way one carries the thing that connects you to the person you are grieving, the physical object that holds the memory of the encounter. She stood in the cold with her violin and listened to John Lennon's music in the December air of Central Park, and she thought about a corner, and a folded piece of paper, and 4 words written in cramped handwriting, and the particular quality of a man's attention when he is listening to something he recognizes as true. New York City breathes. The village moves through its seasons, its corners cycling through their populations of artists and dreamers, their violin cases and guitar cases open to the passing world, their music rising and dispersing in the air above the pavement. The corner of Bleecker and Thompson holds no plaque, no marker, no official acknowledgement of what occurred there on a December evening in 1973. The city does not mark its quiet moments. It leaves them to memory, to the stories told by those who were present, to the music that continues to exist because someone played it in the cold and someone else stopped and listened. The winter comes. The cold returns. And somewhere in the frozen village air, in the space between one street lamp and the next, the echo persists. What if the most important thing a person can do is simply stop on a frozen corner in the December dark and listen, truly listen, to the music that is playing for no one, recognizing in it the thing that deserves to be heard, and staying long enough to make sure that the person playing it knows that someone, at last, has heard?